Open our minds to new ideas and different perspectives with power to spark emotions and inspire change. For centuries, stories have challenged us, and storytellers have helped us make sense of our world. In just 3 years, with 12 followers in a 10-square-mile area, one of the best storytellers on earth captivated crowds and answered questions with stories. Stories about yeast and mustard seeds, about wedding invitations and lost things, stories that feature laborers and Pharisees, tax collectors and Samaritans. Jesus told stories that literally turned ideas about life, love, and faith upside down and changed the world forever.
When I was about 7 years old, I ran away from home. I had it with my family. Taking care of my 2 younger siblings was driving me crazy, and my parents just did not understand the heavy load of the oldest of 3 at 7. And so I took my blue and green paisley suitcase and I packed it up with my favorite belongings. My baby doll Barbara was in there, my favorite cassette tapes. I even had one of those shirts, you'll remember this, when you blew on it and then it changed colors. That was in the suitcase for sure. And then I made my way out of the house, down the driveway, and I was off to start off on my new life. I made it to about the neighbor's house before my dad came out and yelled my name, "Bethany, Bethany." And that was all it took. I turned around, and I ran right into his open arms. This was my first personal experience of the prodigal son, this story that we heard today. And you know, like the father in this story, my dad was not mad. I think he was laughing, actually. But he was so generous in just receiving me back home into his arms. All right, so today we hear about the prodigal son. And I know that it's a well-known story, and many of us might listen to it and think, okay, I know everything you're going to say about this. I've heard this a million times. We've learned about it in Sunday school. And you might have this temptation to start to think, what was I going to have for lunch again? What did we have to get from the store today? I'd like to encourage you to resist that temptation today. Because I have a feeling that God might be nudging you in a new way and opening your hearts to hear this story in a new direction that offers you some encouragement and some challenge as well. Okay, this story is told in Luke 15, and as the chapter begins, we are told that Jesus is with tax collectors and sinners, and this is making the religious leaders pretty upset. They're grumbling and they're complaining. Pastor Nadia Bolz-Weber summarizes it like this. She says, "Now all of the bad people, the ones who deserve to be punished, were coming in to listen to Jesus, and all of the good people, the ones who deserve to be rewarded, were upset about this, and they said, 'He welcomes bad people, and instead of punishing them, he eats with them?' This is a complaint that sometimes we still hear within the church, or we might even feel within ourselves, right? And it speaks to the vulnerability that asks that question, am I enough? Do I belong here? So it's into this space that Jesus tells the story about a father with these 2 sons. You know the story. The younger son asks for his inheritance early. He receives it. He travels to another country, and he foolishly squanders everything he has. Not only has he spent all of his inheritance, but then a famine comes. And so now he's really hurting. He's broke. He's alone. He's miserable. He's hungry. And he decides to go home to his father. The story doesn't tell us if the son is returning initially because he really desires forgiveness and a reconciliation in that relationship, or if he just needs some food and shelter. But either way, he sets off. And as he begins that long journey home, he's practicing the words he's going to say to his father, the various ways that he will seek his dad's forgiveness. And then we hear one of the pivotal verses in this story. This is verse 20. It says, "While he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was moved with compassion. His father ran to him, hugged him, and kissed him." Now, don't miss the timing here. Don't confuse it and miss out on the message. It says, while he was still far off. Some translations say, as soon as the father saw his son, he was filled with compassion He wasn't filled with anger, resentment, or skepticism. He was immediately filled with compassion, with joy, and ran out to meet his child. As far as this father was concerned, one of his children is home, and even after making a real mess of his life, this is worthy of a big celebration. This is mini lesson number 1 in our parable. While you are still far off, God sees you and is filled with compassion and joy. It doesn't matter how long you've been away. It doesn't matter the reason or situation. God rejoices in your return. God has always found happiness in you. Do you remember the story about Jesus' baptism? This is a few chapters before in Luke's gospel. It tells us that as soon as Jesus was baptized, he comes out of the water, and immediately the heavens open and a voice declares, "You are my son, my beloved. In you I find happiness." God celebrates at your baptism. God rejoices when you return home. God will always and immediately find joy in you. This isn't the end of our story. The younger son returns home, and the father has met him with joy, and now it's time to party. They bring out the best food, the best music. They've got the DJ and the fanciest clothes, and the whole community is coming together to celebrate because this son who was once lost has now been found. Now we meet the older son. He's coming in from out of the field, and we're told that while he was yet far off, he sees what's happening. He sees his lost brother. He sees the community. He sees the celebration they're having. But the older brother is not filled immediately with compassion and joy. Instead, in a mirror image to his father, he is immediately filled with fear and resentment and anger. The older brother enters the scene sulking. Now, maybe it's because I'm the oldest in my family, or maybe it's just because I'm human and this is a pretty human experience, but I can really identify with the brother here. He's hardworking, he's responsible, he's always trying to do the right thing. You know that he's the kid in the group project that actually does the work while everyone gets the credit. Here, he has done the work and his brother gets the party. It feels unfair, right? But that's kind of the point. The father shows mercy as he welcomes the younger son home, and mercy is not fair. Mercy is showing compassion towards someone that you have power over. Mercy is showing compassion towards someone who doesn't deserve it. Mercy is one way of saying, you don't deserve this, and I love you anyway. God invites us to be a people of mercy and grace, to be a people who not only love when it is easy or fair, but to love even more deeply when it's not. Jesus is telling this story to religious leaders, to people who are faithful and committed, and to a people who really value boundaries between what is right and what is wrong. They believe that rules are meant to be followed and not broken, and that in following these strict rules, they will understand and know God more deeply in their lives. But now Jesus is turning their world upside down. Jesus comes in and is showing them another way of following God, another way of living. Jesus walks alongside the margins of society and brings everyone into the fold. While they are yet far off, Jesus immediately greets them with compassion and joy. Jesus sets a table, a feast, and invites everyone to come. Jesus practices mercy again and again and again. And in fact, Jesus doesn't seem to pay attention very much to the rules. He tells us instead that there are 2 important and great commandments that we should follow. He says, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your being, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. In fact, Jesus tells us that we are to interpret all of law through this lens. And if something is getting in the way of our loving God and loving our neighbor, we should rethink that. Focus on God's love and mercy present in our lives. God's mercy isn't meant to be fair. It is meant to be loving and generous and good. Do you know what the word prodigal means? We hear it all the time in relation to this story. I thought I had a hand up over here for a second. Okay. The word prodigal means someone who spends or gives lavishly or foolishly. Now, we usually read this and we hear this as the younger son, as the prodigal son. He is the one who foolishly, lavishly spends his money until he has nothing left. But what if we are meant to understand God as the prodigal? That is, it is God who gives in excess. God who lavishly extends us mercy, who loves us so extravagantly that some might call God foolish. It is God's extravagant love that is given to us even when we are undeserving or think that we are beyond redemption. God is, as the father in this story, who immediately experiences joy at his son's return. But God also extends mercy to the son who stayed. Let's go back to the story and see how that turns out. You remember that the older son is coming in from the fields, and he's angry that his dad had such compassion for his brother. "Don't I deserve this too?" he says. And in his anger, he fails to see that he has been a recipient of his father's delight and joy every day. But the father, again, turns to his son, this time the older one, and has wide open arms with love. Twice now, the father has extended extravagant, foolish love and compassion upon his children, not as a reward for their being good, but simply because that is the father's nature. You see, while the older son had never physically left, he managed to alienate and distance himself too. He believed that his worth was tied to what he did, how good he was, maybe even how much better he was than his younger sibling. And he failed to see that he was a recipient of God's mercy and grace in extravagant ways. We are all the prodigal's son, recipients of extravagant, even foolish, love and mercy from God. These two brothers had everything they could ever want or imagine. And I think the real tragedy in this story isn't that one son was selfish and the other son was resentful. I think the real tragedy in our lesson is that neither of these children recognized their parents' love. All that the father had was theirs, no matter what. As the parable closes, we're not told what the resolution is. We don't know if the sons learned their lesson, if they were reconciled, or what happens next. But you know, the story is really about us anyway. It's about how the extravagant, even foolish love of God has the power to change our story and change our lives. It's a reminder that no matter what, you are loved by God and you are worthy of that love. I don't know about you, but I need reminders of that over and over again. And so if you're sitting here today and you are feeling this connection with the older son who feels resentful towards the attention that others are receiving, if you worry that a celebration isn't for you, or maybe you relate to the younger son who has squandered what you have or feels like you never really belong, remember that the fullness of God's mercy and love and grace are yours. They are not a punishment that will be removed, nor a reward that is granted. They are simply yours to have and to know because you are God's own. You know, maybe it's the storyteller or the preacher in me, but sometimes when I read the end of this parable, I wonder what happens next. What would Jesus tell us is the next chapter in this story? And here's what I imagine. I picture that the older brother comes to the party at last, and at first he's standing around the edges, pretty serious, just watching what's happening. The music is playing, there's a fire going, and you can see the glow and the embers around the room. His brother is all smiles. He's dancing and receiving hugs and being welcomed back into the community. And the older brother is not so sure. But then a new song begins to play, and this time it's a familiar song from their childhood. The older brother begins to tap his toes, his body begins to sway, and then he catches his brother's eye. They remember this song. They remember the joy they experienced with this music, and they slowly wave their hands at each other, and smiles begin to creep on their faces. After a while, they find themselves dancing and hugging each other on the dance floor, remembering the days when they knew and trusted their own belovedness, trusting to believe that somehow that night they would find their way back again. And then I imagine the father watching all of this, standing maybe in a dark corner off to the side, watching his sons reunite, and he smiles. Let us pray. Gracious and extravagant God, while we were yet far off, you met us with compassion and mercy and joy. As soon as you see us, you immediately respond with joy. Help us to see and to trust that we are yours. Inspire our living that our whole lives tell the story of your prodigal love. Amen.